When I first turned the key in the front door of the house on Hawthorne Lane, I expected nothing more than peace. After 23 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, half of them in muddy boots and the rest behind flood mitigation blueprints, I was ready for silence, birdsong, maybe some squeaky porch swings, and backyard barbecues. I didn't move to Hawthorne Lane for drama. I moved there to heal. The house was modest, but sturdy, 2-story cedar siding and a deep backyard sloping gently toward a row of maple trees that blushed red in late October. The previous owner had left behind a rusted garden shed, a few tomato cages, and a mailbox still dented from the last hailstorm. I didn't mind. It reminded me of structure, of something earned. The neighborhood itself felt like a postcard. Lawns trimmed to military precision. American flags fluttering from porches, Labradors wagging behind white picket fences. Retirees walked slow, morning laps. Kids biked in lazy circles. Sprinklers hissed like summer snakes. It was everything my late wife had dreamed of when we talked about someday. Someday came late, and she never made it here. But I did. I carried her memory into every room. I'd only been in the house 3 days when I noticed something off. It was early, just after a light drizzle. I stepped out with a cup of coffee, enjoying the mist and the earthy smell of wet mulch, when I spotted the storm drain at the corner of my yard. It was barely visible, half covered in leaves, and what looked like a thin steel mesh. I walked closer, crouched, and ran my hand across it. The grate had been intentionally covered with a thick plastic barrier bolted into the frame. I peeled back the edge and saw sediment backing up behind it, water pooling where it should have drained. As someone who'd spent a lifetime studying watershed systems, I knew this wasn't accidental. This wasn't leaves clogging the grate. This was human interference. Across the street, I noticed another drain in the same condition. Then another, 3 in a row, blocked. I stood there a while, my coffee cooling in my hand, the first whisper of unease curling in my gut. Blocking a storm drain isn't just careless, it's dangerous. In heavy rain, water would rise. Streets would flood. Vehicles could be lifted, property damaged, and in the worst cases, lives lost. But maybe this was a maintenance issue. Maybe it was temporary. I gave the benefit of the doubt, walked back inside, and scribbled a note to myself to contact the Homeowners Association in the morning. It seemed like the right thing to do. After all, I was the new guy. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as some grumpy retiree throwing his weight around. The next day, I called the number listed on the HOA welcome packet. A woman answered. Clipped tone, maybe mid-40s. She introduced herself as Karen. Just Karen. No last name. I explained who I was, that I had just moved in, and wanted to ask about the blocked storm drains. I made sure my voice was calm, even friendly. I mentioned my background without bragging, and expressed concern that the modifications might lead to issues in the rainy season. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then a sharp exhale. Oh, those, she said. We had them sealed for aesthetic reasons. Leaves and debris were unsightly. It's part of the new HOA landscaping policy ratified last quarter. I blinked. Aesthetic reasons. I understand wanting to keep the neighborhood clean, I replied carefully. But storm drains are part of the civil infrastructure. Blocking them can be a violation of municipal code, not to mention a public safety risk. Karen's voice hardened. Well, we've had complaints from homeowners about stagnant puddles and mosquito larvae. Sealing the drains was a community decision. My grip tightened on the phone. Stagnant water forms because the drains are blocked, I said. It's the exact opposite of what should be happening. You're creating standing water, not preventing it. There was a long pause. Sir Karen finally said, if you're unhappy with our policies, you're welcome to attend the next board meeting. In the meantime, I'd advise you not to tamper with any HOA-managed infrastructure. The call ended before I could respond. I stood there, phone pressed against my chest, the line gone dead in my ear, and felt the air change. This wasn't a friendly neighborhood association run by volunteers planting flowers and planning bake sales. This was something else, something rigid, something that reeked of control. That night, I walked the block again. Noticed 6 more storm drains covered with plastic sandbags or steel mesh. Some were completely sealed. Others had small holes drilled in, perhaps to give the illusion of functionality. It wasn't just poor maintenance. It was a system. The next morning, I attended the HOA meeting. Karen sat at the head of the table in a crisp blazer flanked by 3 other board members who looked more like gatekeepers than neighbors. I raised my concerns politely. I offered to share hydrology maps. I even offered to personally clean the grates. They smiled, nodded, and then introduced a motion to fine me for tampering with HOA landscaping features. $100. I hadn't even touched the drains. The motion passed unanimously. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with ignorance. I was dealing with power, misused. And I'd seen what that looked like before in war zones and boardrooms alike. But never in a cul-de-sac with bird feeders and lawn gnomes. Never where I came to heal. I didn't have to wait long to meet Karen in the flesh. The morning after the board meeting, I was in my garage organizing tool racks when I heard the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking against pavement. It was too deliberate to be a casual neighborly stroll. When I looked up there, she was walking with posture so stiff it could have cracked. Karen, mid-40s, maybe early 50s. Perfectly styled platinum blonde bob. Oversized sunglasses that didn't quite hide the sharp glint of scrutiny in her eyes. A pink blazer buttoned too tight across her chest, clipboard in one hand, HOA-branded tote bag in the other. "Good morning," she called in a tone that carried the energy of a cease and desist letter. "Morning," I replied, setting down the drill and wiping my hands on a rag. "I'm Karen," she said, stepping onto my driveway like she owned the concrete. "We spoke on the phone yesterday." I nodded. "Yes, I remember. About the storm drains." Her lips twitched in something between a smile and a warning. "Right. I just thought I'd introduce myself in person and drop off the updated HOA compliance guidelines. We like to make sure all new homeowners are brought up to speed." She handed me the clipboard. Attached was a 10-page document in 12-point Times New Roman, full of terms like visual cohesion standards, drainage beautification zones, and unapproved commentary discouragement. I'd read military service contracts that were easier to follow. "Appreciate it," I said, flipping through the pages. "Are these guidelines voted on by all homeowners or just the board?" Karen blinked behind her sunglasses. "The board is elected," she said flatly, "and empowered to make decisions in the community's best interest." I tried to keep my tone level. "Including decisions that override city infrastructure codes." Karen's jaw stiffened. "We have a beautification initiative in place approved last year. The drains were an eyesore, and in some cases, a safety hazard for children. Open grates can cause injuries. That's what grate covers are for," I replied. "Not permanent seals. You're redirecting water flow. That's not just a neighborhood matter. It's a public safety issue." Her lips thinned. "Callahan," I said. "Jack Callahan." "Mr. Callahan," she said slowly. "We welcome feedback at our monthly board meetings, but continued antagonism of board decisions could be considered disruptive conduct under Section 4B of the Compliance Agreement." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that before or after Section 4A? The part where the HOA floods the street?" A flicker of red crept into her cheeks. She shifted gears quickly. "I noticed your lawn hasn't been edged to the curb. We do encourage uniform presentation along the block. It reflects pride in our community." Ah. The pivot. When challenged on logic attack with aesthetics, I was planning to reseed the edges after the next rain, I said. "But if the drains are sealed, that might not go well." She turned slightly, surveying my front yard like a property appraiser. "Also, your trash bins are visible from the sidewalk. I brought them in an hour after pickup. We recommend no more than 30 minutes. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about the way her eyes scanned my house. Not looking for problems, cataloging them. I'd seen that same look from safety inspectors in Kandahar and zoning officials in Louisiana. It was the gaze of someone who believed rules were tools for control, not safety. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. Karen smiled a precise politician's smile. "Wonderful. Enjoy your weekend." She turned and walked away, heels ticking again on the pavement, like a countdown. I watched her stride toward the next house, clipboard-ready tote bag, bouncing against her hip like a sheriff's holster. Behind her, the storm clouds were already gathering, literally. That weekend, the forecast called for light rain, a prelude to the season's first big storm. I spent the afternoon rechecking my home's perimeter, ensuring gutters were clear and downspouts weren't blocked. Out of habit, I walked the block again, counting grates. Of the 11 visible storm drains on Hawthorne Lane, 9 were sealed. 2 remained partially open, both near my property, though barely functional. It was a flood risk waiting to happen. And Karen, she was hosting a neighborhood wine night. Tents going up fairy lights strung across driveways, chairs borrowed from the clubhouse. A small sea of folding tables filled with snacks, sparkling rosé, and HOA board members in matching polo shirts. I wasn't invited. But that didn't stop me from walking by, nodding politely to neighbors I hadn't met yet. Some nodded back. Others turned away, clearly briefed. Karen raised her glass toward me, with a grin too wide to be genuine. "Hope to see you at the next board meeting, Mr. Callahan." I smiled and kept walking, hands in my pockets, memorizing license plates and driveway slopes. In the Army, we called it terrain familiarity. Knowing where the high ground is before the storm hits. Because it was coming. And this time, it wouldn't just be rain. The storm arrived exactly 9 days later. The sky had been brooding all morning, swollen and gray, like a bruise. By mid-afternoon, thunder cracked low and lazy across the horizon. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching as the first drops hit the concrete with soft, deliberate taps. It wasn't panic-inducing. Not yet. Just a slow, steady rain, the kind that lulled people into forgetting what water could become when it had nowhere to go. But I knew better. Years of engineering combat flood zones in Missouri, Louisiana, and overseas had taught me to read the signs. The runoff angle on the street, the accumulation rate, the way gutters spit instead of drain when the water couldn't find its path. Hawthorne Lane was sloped slightly downhill from one end to the other, and every sealed storm drain created a bottleneck in that descent. If the water kept coming, gravity would find its own route. That evening, I sent my first formal email to the HOA board. I laid it out clearly blocked. Storm drains violated Municipal Code 14.08.37, which required unobstructed flow during declared storm seasons. I cited the recent forecast from the county's emergency management system and attached photos of at least 8 drains on the block completely sealed. My tone was respectful, but firm. I'd dealt with bureaucracy before. You get further with facts than fury. I even included a PDF from the city engineer's office describing floodplain absorption limits for residential streets. I clicked send. An hour later, I received an automatic reply. Thank you for your concern. The HOA board has already evaluated the issue and considers the matter resolved. No further action required at this time. No name, no signature, just silence. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. That weekend, I ran into one of my neighbors, Luis, while walking to the mailbox. Middle-aged, friendly, always had jazz playing in the garage when he worked on his old Buick. "Hey, Jack," he called out. "Saw your email. Karen posted about it in the neighborhood app." "She did?" I asked. Luis gave me a look. "Yeah. Said you were trying to create panic and spreading misinformation." "Misinformation?" I raised an eyebrow. "She said the drains were sealed for mosquito control and that the city was aware. Called you a self-proclaimed expert stirring the pot." He paused. "Honestly, man, I don't know. I mean, you seem to know what you're talking about, but Karen, she's got people wrapped around her. Thanks for telling me. She also mentioned you were seen tampering with HOA equipment last week." I clenched my jaw. I hadn't tampered with anything. I'd walked the block with a flashlight and taken pictures. But in Karen's world, observation was defiance, and defiance was criminal. That night, I received a formal notice in my mailbox on HOA letterhead informing me I was being fined $150 for unauthorized activity near community infrastructure. There were no details, no photos, no timestamps, just an accusation and a demand for payment. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so transparent. This was retaliation. I didn't pay. Instead, I submitted an appeal and printed 5 copies of my documentation city code violations, engineering reports and photos of each blocked drain labeled and time-stamped. I hand-delivered them to the HOA office Dropbox with a letter demanding the fine be revoked and the drains reopened. I heard nothing, but I started noticing things. The next morning, my mailbox door was hanging open, bent. Not broken, just damaged enough to catch my attention. A few days later, someone dumped a bag of mulch across my driveway. Neighborhood kids, maybe. But it felt pointed, calculated. I'd been in too many small-town showdowns to mistake coincidence for coordination. Karen didn't need to yell, she had followers, and she was using them. Still, I kept to the high ground. I documented everything. I installed 2 motion-activated cameras, one above the garage and one on the lamppost out front. I didn't tell anyone, just let them blink red in the night. The real turning point came during a community walkthrough the following week. Karen led a small group of residents up and down the street, clipboard in hand, like a realtor on parade. She paused in front of my house, stared at my gutters, jotted something down, and then smiled at me. "Mr. Callahan," she said sweetly, "we've received additional complaints about the slope of your side lawn. It may be contributing to water pooling near the street." I stared at her dumbfounded. "Water pooling because the storm drains are sealed." Karen's smile didn't budge. "We'll be issuing a landscaping notice. You have 10 days to comply. And if I don't..." "Well," she said, tilting her head, "then we'll have to escalate, of course. Rules are rules." For the first time, I felt a genuine surge of anger rise in my throat. Not because I was being harassed, but because I knew exactly what would happen when the big storm came. And Karen, she wouldn't take responsibility. She'd blame the weather, the city, the residents, me. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I prepared. I mapped every drain on the block and documented every obstruction. I built a file that included photos, dates, topographical overlays, and rainfall estimates. I backed up every email and printed every city code I could find. I even used my old Army drone to fly a quick elevation scan of the block during a light drizzle to show how water accumulated unnaturally near the sealed grates. And then I waited. The next storm was already building in the Gulf. The meteorologists said it would be a moderate system, but the pressure drop told me otherwise. This one would hit harder than the last. And when it did, the street wouldn't be ready. Not because of nature, but because of negligence. And maybe then, just maybe, someone would finally listen. It was just past midnight when I heard the clinking. A faint metallic noise like tools brushing against concrete. It came in soft bursts, followed by the low rumble of wheels rolling over gravel. I sat up in bed, heart beating slow but heavy. It wasn't the sound of an animal, it wasn't the wind, it was deliberate, human. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain just an inch. Outside, the world was drenched in the blue tint of a halogen street lamp. Rain had been falling for hours, not a torrent, not yet, but steady. The kind of rainfall that softened earth and coated streets in a slick sheen. Shadows moved across my side yard, just out of reach of the light. I saw a figure crouched beside the storm drain near my fence, backlit, gloved, head down. He was working. Another figure stood just behind him, holding something, a clipboard, numbered a flashlight. I narrowed my eyes and stepped away from the window. Silently, I pulled on jeans and a flannel shirt, laced up my boots, and grabbed the umbrella hanging behind the front door, not to shield me from the rain, but as cover. I stepped outside. The figures didn't notice me at first. They were so focused, so precise, they didn't think to look up. The one crouching was tightening bolts over the grate, replacing the last remaining open storm drain on the block with a solid metal cover. The flashlight moved, revealing her face. Karen. She wasn't wearing the pink blazer this time. Just a gray windbreaker with the HOA logo stitched over the chest. Her face was bare, but her jaw was set with a tension I recognized from battlefields and bureaucratic showdowns alike. The look of someone who knew they were doing something wrong, but had convinced themselves it was right. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I said, stepping forward. Karen jumped the flashlight beam, swinging wildly before landing on my face. The man beside her, mid-30s, maybe HOA maintenance or a hired contractor, stood quickly, his wrench still in hand. "This is private property," I said, voice low but firm. "That drain is on the easement line. You have no authority to seal it." Karen straightened, brushing her hands together like she'd just finished gardening. "Mr. Callahan, you're mistaken. This is part of a routine maintenance operation authorized by the board." At midnight, she ignored the sarcasm. "This drain has been causing erosion on the adjoining lot. We've had complaints." "From who?" "The raccoons." Karen took a step toward me. "You're not authorized to interfere with HOA work crews." I could feel the heat in my chest, but I kept my voice measured. "I'm not interfering. I'm documenting. You're sealing the only active drain left on this end of the block. That's obstruction of public infrastructure. That's a civil code violation." She smiled tightly. "That's your opinion." "No," I said. "That's the law." The contractor shifted uncomfortably. He looked between us then at the drain and finally muttered, "Maybe we should just come back in the morning." Karen didn't answer. She was staring at me, calculating. "You can finish this if you want," I said, pulling out my phone and aiming it straight at her. "Just know I'm recording, and the city will see this." Karen froze. In that moment, the illusion cracked. She wasn't some all-powerful HOA queen. She was a suburban bully with a title and a clipboard caught in the act, and she knew it. She turned to the contractor. "Let's go." He didn't argue. They wheeled the toolbox back toward the sidewalk. Karen didn't look at me again. But as she passed under the street lamp, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't anger or even fear. It was something colder. Contempt. They disappeared into the dark, the sound of their wheels fading into the rain. I walked to the drain and crouched. The bolts had been started but not tightened. I unscrewed them by hand, pulled off the new steel plate, and set it gently beside the grate. Water trickled through, soft and steady. The storm was building now. I could feel it in the air, the pressure drop, the way the clouds thickened above the rooftops. I looked down the street and saw the other drains, all sealed, every one of them. And now I knew this wasn't just negligence. It was sabotage. The next morning, I filed a complaint with the Public Works Department. I attached time-stamped images from my security cameras, photos of the altered drain, and a report of unauthorized activity on residential infrastructure. I copied the city engineer, the district council member, and the legal department. I also uploaded the footage to a cloud drive just in case. But the response once again was slow. Too slow. Public Works replied with a standard message: "We've received your report and will review the matter within 14 business days." 14 days. But the storm wasn't going to wait. Neither was Karen. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA fining me $250 for intimidation of board personnel and obstruction of scheduled maintenance. That was the moment I stopped playing defense. I began preparing for the inevitable. I installed 2 more cameras, one inside the garden gnome near the curb, another under the eave of my garage. I printed every photo, every code, every ordinance. I even recorded a short video message walking through the blocked drain issue, citing city code and referencing exact rainfall capacities. It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. Because I'd seen what floodwaters could do when people ignored physics. And I was starting to believe Karen didn't care about physics. She cared about power. And sometimes the only way to stop a flood is to let it come. I spent the better part of the next 3 days in what could only be described as wartime preparation. Except instead of sandbags and radio towers, it was spreadsheets, statutes, and long chains of emails that went unanswered. At the heart of it all sat my growing digital dossier, a folder on my desktop labeled HOA Drain Evidence. Growing more bloated by the hour, I'd organized everything, time-stamped photos of every sealed storm drain, on Hawthorne Lane video files of Karen's midnight tampering, screenshots of my security cam footage, local rainfall predictions, and historical data on runoff capacity from the city's civil engineering archives. I even included a technical brief I wrote during my Army Corps days on urban flash flooding in mid-density suburbs. But all the knowledge in the world means nothing if no one's willing to look. I sent my formal report to the City of Rosegrove's Department of Public Works again this time, attaching a copy to the city engineer's personal assistant, the assistant's assistant, and even the generic info at email listed on their outdated municipal site. I filed a secondary complaint through the county's Civil Code Enforcement portal. I even submitted a tip, yes, a tip, to a local investigative news station called Neighborhood Watchdog, which boasted a reputation for exposing zoning abuse and HOA corruption. And still nothing. No call. No visit. No inspection. I checked the portal daily. Status pending review. It was like screaming into a rain barrel. My military training had taught me that bureaucracy isn't built for speed. It's built for plausible deniability, for delay, for red tape so thick that the truth suffocates before anyone hears it. But time was running out. The National Weather Service issued a revised bulletin by the end of the week. A tropical depression from the Gulf had shifted course and was now expected to hit our region within 48 hours. The language in the alert was measured bureaucratic, but to those of us who could read between the lines, it screamed urgency. Significant rainfall accumulation expected. Urban flooding possible in poorly drained areas. I knew what that meant. On a normal street, the water would pool and recede. But with every storm drain sealed shut, Hawthorne Lane wasn't a street anymore. It was a trench. That evening, I walked the block again, not because I expected to fix anything, but because I couldn't not look. Old habits die hard. I checked each drain like I was inspecting a failing levee. All still sealed. 2 of them had fresh bolts Karen had doubled down. It made me sick. As I passed one house, a neighbor named Jenna, opened her front door, and stepped out to grab a package. She saw me hesitated, and then gave a small, polite nod. She'd always been quiet, 2 kids' husband deployed overseas minivan in the driveway. I paused. "You prepared for the storm?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "Karen said it's nothing, just some rain. Said the HOA has it under control." I couldn't hide the incredulity in my face. "She told you that?" "She sent out a message in the app. Something about not listening to fear-mongering and that the drains were being managed according to landscape flow principles. Whatever that means. It meant lies. But I bit my tongue. "I'd move your car up the driveway if I were you," I said instead. "And get anything off the floor in the garage." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you really think it'll be that bad?" I looked at the sky, the low shifting clouds, beginning to turn that strange green-gray hue, heavy with something more than rain. "I don't think," I said. "I know." The next morning, I checked the mailbox. No city response, no site inspector, no camera crew. But inside, among the junk flyers and utility bills, sat another envelope with the HOA logo embossed in gold. Another fine. This one for unauthorized contact with residents regarding non-approved safety matters. $250. They were fining me for talking to a neighbor about flooding. I laughed, loud. The sound echoed down the empty street, bouncing off pastel-colored homes and hydrangea planters. It wasn't funny. But it was so absurd, I couldn't stop myself. I didn't pay the fine. Instead, I updated my file. I added a new tab to my spreadsheet. HOA Retaliation Actions. Dates, fines, interactions all cross-referenced with my complaint activity. I even included a separate column. Potential legal violations. Legal. That night, I called an old contact from my Army days, Monica Levinson, now a civil litigation attorney who owed me more than a few favors. I laid it all out, the blocked drains, the impending storm, the retaliatory fines. I offered to send her everything. Her voice was tight. "This sounds like a ticking time bomb." "It is," I said. "And when it explodes, they're going to pretend no one warned them." "I'll draft a preservation letter," she said. "Force them to retain all internal communications. If it comes to litigation, you'll need proof of their decisions." "Appreciate it, Monica. You always did have a thing for lost causes." "Not lost yet," I said, "just buried underwater." The rain began that night, soft at first, then steady. I sat at my desk, eyes fixed on the blinking cursor of another email draft. This time to the mayor's office. I copied the city council, the fire marshal, even the state office of emergency services. Subject line: Imminent HOA facilitated flood risk on Hawthorne Lane. Urgent. I hit send. Then I waited. Outside, the gutters already sang their watery song. Inside, I whispered a silent hope that maybe, someone in authority would read what I'd written before the water swallowed the proof. The storm didn't arrive with a roar. It crept in slow and steady like a tide, inching toward an unsuspecting shore. By noon the next day, the sky was the color of old pewter. Winds whispered through the trees, not fierce but purposeful, bending branches like they were leaning in to listen. The first sheets of rain began to fall around 1:30 p.m., and by 3 Huzro, the gutters on my roof were spilling over. I stood by the living room window, arms crossed, watching water snake along the curb like it was searching for a way out. But there was none. The drain nearest my yard, the one I had fought so hard to keep open, had been sealed again. Someone had returned in the night. No doubt Karen or one of her loyal foot soldiers. The rain kept falling. By 5:00 p.m., visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The streetlights flickered on in the middle of the day, casting hazy halos through the downpour. My phone buzzed with a local alert. Flash flood warning issued for Rose Grove County. Seek higher ground if necessary. I read it, then looked down the street and saw water already creeping past the first sidewalk lines. My training kicked in. I moved fast, pulled on boots, rain gear, headlamp. I stepped out into the torrent and sloshed through ankle-deep water to my neighbors' homes, knocking door to door. Some answered with wide eyes and furrowed brows. Others hesitated, clearly confused why the storm was already swallowing their yards. I knocked on Jenna's door. She opened it, holding a baby on her hip, her older daughter clinging to her leg. "Get your cars up the driveway now," I said. "Higher ground as close to the house as you can. If you have anything valuable in the garage, move it up." She didn't question me this time. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight with fear. Across the street, Luis was already outside, frantically moving boxes into his SUV. His old Buick was half submerged. "This ain't normal rain, Jack," he shouted over the sound of the storm. "This is a damn river." "I know," I yelled back. "The drains are sealed." He swore and nodded toward his car. "It's already stalling." By 6:15 p.m., the water had reached knee level on the low side of the block. I watched it lap up driveways, curl around trash bins, and pool in garage doors. Several cars parked on the street left overnight by guests or residents were already beginning to shift. Tires floated. Alarms shrieked in protest. A white SUV spun slowly like a forgotten toy in a bathtub. Karen's SUV. It had been parked on the curb near the corner where the street sloped most, and now it was drifting. I couldn't lie, I felt something rise in my chest. Not joy, not satisfaction. Something colder, something heavy. Consequences. She had chosen this, and now the water was choosing her. I ran back into my house and climbed to the second floor where I'd set up my old Army-issue binoculars. Through the rain-slicked glass, I scanned the street, panning over the chaos. That's when I saw her. Karen, barefoot, in a soaked bathrobe, hair plastered to her head, was wading into the water, arms outstretched toward her car as it drifted further and further away. She screamed something, but the wind drowned it out. I watched as she stumbled, caught herself on a mailbox, then slipped again. Water nearly to her waist now. The current wasn't swift, but it was steady, relentless. I bolted outside. I didn't want her hurt. For all her arrogance, for all the threats and fines and smirks, I wasn't going to let this storm become a death sentence. "Karen," I shouted, splashing through the water. "Get back to your porch." She turned, wild-eyed mascara streaked down her cheeks like war paint. "My car," she shrieked. "Forget the car," I yelled. "You'll be swept under if you fall." Behind us, another car, Luis's Buick, lifted off the asphalt with a sickening groan, twisted sideways, and slammed into the curb with a splash. The water surged higher. Karen froze. Then finally, she backed away, stumbling toward her porch, sobbing as she climbed the flooded steps. I didn't follow. I just turned and walked back to my own home, drenched, heart hammering not from fear but fury. She had watched this unfold. She had sealed the drains. She had ignored every warning. And now the entire block was paying the price. The night passed like something from a war zone. Flashlights flickering in windows. Backup generators humming. Residents yelling over the roar of rain. I heard a window shatter 2 houses down. Water pressure likely broke the glass. At one point, I saw 2 teenagers floating a kayak down the street, paddling with a rake. I didn't sleep. I sat in my upstairs hallway with a portable radio and a thermos of coffee, checking my camera feeds and monitoring the water level. Around 3:00 a.m., the rain finally began to slow. And when the sun rose at 6:45, the neighborhood looked like a battlefield. Vehicles were lodged sideways across lawns. One mailbox had been completely uprooted and was wedged beneath Karen's porch steps. Garage doors hung open, debris pouring out like entrails. Trash cans bobbed in the shallow water like buoys in a gray sea. And the storm drains, still sealed, still useless. But now, finally, no one could deny what had happened. No one could pretend this was normal. And as I stood there on my porch, soaked to the bone but dry in spirit, I knew something had changed. Not just in the landscape, in the narrative. Karen's reign of control had met something bigger than her rules. It had met nature. And nature always keeps the receipts. The morning after the flood wasn't quiet. It groaned. The neighborhood echoed with the shrill buzz of power tools, car alarms, still whining like injured animals, and the deep metallic creaks of waterlogged vehicles settling into warped asphalt. Every lawn looked like a disaster zone, uprooted shrubs, broken fences. Piles of mulch and garbage tangled in twisted plastic. But nothing stood out more than the cars. They were everywhere. Twisted, scattered like toys tossed across a playroom floor. Some perched on top of one another. Some crumpled against fire hydrants. One white sedan had been lifted clear across the road and wedged halfway into the Henderson's front porch railing. Its back wheels still spun slowly, clicking in the wind. I counted 14 vehicles visibly damaged, most beyond repair. I knew from my time working post-hurricane recovery zones that this was just surface damage. The real trouble was still underneath basements, filled with water, electrical panels, fried foundations soaked deep and weak. But it wasn't just property that had been wounded. It was trust. Neighbors stood in groups, arms folded, faces pale, not talking much. Some filmed with phones. Others just stared at their cars like they were witnessing a personal betrayal. Luis walked across the flooded street, sloshing water up to his shins, and stood beside me in silence for a moment. He looked like hell-wet boots, mud-streaked jeans, hollow eyes. "My Buick's gone," he said finally. I nodded. I saw it, took the mailbox with it. He gave a bitter laugh. "I had that car since college, man. I'm sorry." He turned to me. "You tried to warn us." I didn't answer. What was there to say? From across the street, we heard a scream. Karen. She stood on her porch robe, still wet from the night before, yelling at two men in HOA jackets as they inspected a fallen lamppost in front of her home. Her SUV had finally come to a stop 3 houses down, lodged nose first into a retaining wall. The driver's side door hung open like a flag of surrender. I couldn't hear all her words, but her tone was clear: panic, desperation, blame. She gestured toward the street, toward the cars, toward the sky. She pointed at the broken fence, then at me. The 2 HOA men exchanged glances, then quietly walked away. Karen's voice followed them, cracking with emotion. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she shrieked. It was surreal. Watching someone so smug and untouchable unravel in broad daylight, stripped of her illusion of control. No clipboard, no blazer, no mask of authority. Just a woman drenched in her own mistakes, surrounded by the wreckage she helped create. I didn't feel pity. Not yet. I walked back to my porch, opened my laptop, and uploaded the last batch of footage to the cloud. Drone shots from before the storm, video clips from the security cameras, timestamps, and elevation overlays. Everything was ready. At 11:04 a.m., I received a call from Monica. "Hey," she said without preamble. I saw the news. Rose Grove made the regional channel. "Let me guess, freak flooding surprises suburban neighborhood." "Pretty much." They showed footage of a car on top of a mailbox. "Yours." "Luis's." She was quiet for a beat. "You ready to go public?" "I've got everything I said. Proof that HOA sealed critical infrastructure. Emails, footage, warnings. All time-stamped." "Good. I'm reaching out to the city attorney this afternoon." This isn't just negligence. It's willful misconduct. I stared out at the street. A small child in rain boots was splashing in a puddle beside a broken tricycle. "People lost cars," I said. "Some of these folks live paycheck to paycheck." "I know." I think Karen thought she could control nature the way she controlled people. "Nature doesn't give warnings," Monica said. "You did." At 2:30 p.m., a truck from the City Public Works Department rolled onto Hawthorne Lane. 2 men in orange vests stepped out and began inspecting drains. One of them shook his head and made a call. By 4:00 p.m., a team of 6 had arrived with crowbars, drills, and water vacuums. They began unsealing each storm drain, yanking off metal plates, cutting through plastic barriers, draining the standing water. And with every piece they pulled up, the HOA's narrative crumbled further. At 5:15 p.m., an unmarked city car parked in front of Karen's house. A woman in a navy blue suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. "City inspector." She walked up to Karen's door and knocked. Karen answered. Her voice was shrill again. But this time it wasn't with power. It was with fear. The inspector didn't flinch. By dusk, the entire block had become a case file. Neighbors started gathering on my lawn, not to accuse or scold, but to ask questions. "What did you see? What did you report? Who do we contact? Can we file together?" I pulled out a folder from the porch table and laid it flat. "Everything's here," I said. "Dates, images, code violations. You can add your statements. Monica's putting together a class action filing. We can move together." One by one, they stepped forward. Jenna signed first, then Luis, then Mr. Tran from the end of the block, then the woman with the toddler twins, then the older couple with the birdhouse collection. They didn't look angry. They looked awake. And Karen. She watched from her porch, alone, hands trembling. The final unraveling of Karen didn't happen in a courtroom or a news broadcast. It happened at 6:47 a.m., 2 days after the flood, as the neighborhood slowly crawled toward recovery, and the street still smelled faintly of mold, gasoline, and soaked drywall. I was sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug on my porch when it happened. She came out barefoot, in a tattered robe, once pale pink, now streaked with mud and desperation. Her hair, normally styled like she'd stepped out of a salon, had clung to her scalp in wet clumps. Dark circles hung under her eyes, and the mascara she hadn't fully scrubbed off had bled into raccoon rings. And then she started to scream. It wasn't loud at first, more of a frustrated howl into the morning air. But it grew. Raw. Unfiltered. Like something primitive and broken had finally broken loose. "Why aren't they doing anything?" she shouted at no one and everyone. "Where's the city? Where's the cleanup crew?" She stood in the middle of her porch, fists clenched, veins in her neck, straining. "This isn't my fault. I did what was right. I was protecting the neighborhood." I looked down the street. A few heads poked out of windows, curtains parted. Luis stepped out with his coffee. Jenna stood behind her screen door, watching with wide eyes. No one moved. No one answered. Karen wasn't looking for a conversation. She was unspooling. "You think this is fair?" she shrieked, eyes darting across driveways. "I worked tirelessly for this community. I built this HOA, and now everyone's turning on me like I'm the enemy." Her voice cracked. "I followed the bylaws. I enforced the rules. I kept the streets clean. She paused, voice faltering. "I was just trying to keep things beautiful." That last word dropped from her lips like a broken glass. Beautiful. That's what she had called it when she sealed the drains. Aesthetic landscaping. Beautification compliance. Her words echoed in my mind, each one now warped by the reality that surrounded us: waterlogged mail, sagging fences, destroyed vehicles, insurance adjusters, crawling over lawns like ants. She turned suddenly, pointing directly at my porch. "And you," she screamed, "you think you're the hero now. You sabotaged me. You poisoned this community with your paranoia and your cameras and your military complex. You wanted this flood. You orchestrated it." I stood slowly. "I warned you," I said evenly. "I gave you every chance, every report, every document." Her laugh was jagged like broken glass through air. "You think the city cares? They don't. They never do. You'll see. They'll bury this like they bury everything." Behind her, a white sedan pulled up, unmarked but official. A man in a charcoal suit stepped out, followed by a woman holding a file folder. Karen turned to see them and froze. The man approached, calmly introducing himself as Agent Rothman, with the County Flood Risk Assessment Division. The woman beside him flipped open the folder and read aloud a summary: municipal code violations, tampering with city infrastructure, obstruction of flood pathways, and personal liability pending investigation. Karen's face went slack. You can't be serious," she said. "I was acting on behalf of the HOA." Rothman didn't blink. "The HOA does not have jurisdiction over city-managed drainage systems. And based on the video footage submitted by multiple residents, you personally oversaw the obstruction of critical stormwater infrastructure, including directing its installation during an active flood season." "I didn't." He raised a hand. "You'll have the opportunity to respond during the investigation. For now, we'll need you to sign this notice of inquiry and turn over all HOA documentation related to infrastructure changes made in the last 12 months. She stumbled backward into the doorframe, gripping the railing as if the porch might float away beneath her. Luis whispered beside me, "That's what real consequences look like." I didn't answer, because I was watching something rare. The collapse of a tyrant. Not with handcuffs or shouting, but with paper. With silence. With the weight of her own actions finally crashing down after years of deflection. Karen slowly reached for the pen. Her hand trembled as she signed. When they left, she didn't scream again. She just stood there, small and wet, on a porch that used to command attention, but now looked like a stage after the curtain had dropped. That afternoon, the neighborhood gathered again, this time. Without invites, without HOA banners, without Karen. People brought folding chairs and casseroles and rakes. We formed cleanup teams, helped each other drain basements, set up a carpool list for those whose vehicles had been destroyed. Jenna brought out lemonade. Luis fixed someone's sump pump. Someone played an old speaker with soft bluegrass tunes drifting through the air. And in the center of it all, no one mentioned the word HOA. It wasn't rebellion. It was rebirth. That evening, Monica called. "I spoke with the city attorney," she said. "They're taking it seriously now. A formal hearing's being scheduled, and your footage is going to be central to the investigation." "Good," I said, watching kids draw chalk suns on the newly drying sidewalk. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think for the first time in a while I am." Because the rain had come, and it had taken more than cars. It had taken masks. And sometimes that's what it takes for people to see clearly. The county courthouse was an old sandstone building that stood like a relic against the skyline, weathered but immovable, like it had watched 1,000 people come and go, each believing their story was the most important. On the morning of the hearing, I sat in the hallway outside courtroom 3B with my manila folder clutched in one hand, and Monica Levinson beside me, calm and unreadable, in her charcoal pantsuit. She'd flown in the night before from D.C., just as she promised. "You ready?" she asked, flipping through her notes one last time. "I've lived this every day for the past 3 months," I said. "Yeah, I'm ready." We weren't suing for money. Not yet. This was an evidentiary hearing, a preliminary session, to determine whether the HOA under Karen's leadership had violated municipal ordinances and knowingly contributed to preventable flood damage. If the county found cause, a civil suit would follow, and possibly more. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by a junior attorney who looked like he'd just passed the bar, and a stiff-looking man I recognized as the HOA's treasurer. Karen's expression was unreadable, but her eyes flicked toward me with the cautious resentment of someone who'd underestimated their opponent one too many times. The judge, an older woman named Dana Huynh, called the room to order. What followed felt less like a court hearing and more like a forensic autopsy of every decision Karen had made over the last 6 months. And I was holding the scalpel. Monica started by introducing the Stormwater Ordinance, Section 18.06210 of the Rose Grove Municipal Code. All storm drains must remain unobstructed to allow for full water diversion during declared wet seasons. She submitted a packet of photographic evidence, dozens of images taken by me and by other residents showing sealed drains, piled sandbags, and altered infrastructure. We then played the footage from my garage camera, Karen at midnight, overseeing the installation of the final steel plate over the last working drain. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Her attorney objected, citing privacy violations. The judge overruled it, noting that the footage was taken from my own property and showed activity on a public easement. Next, we submitted the email chain, my warnings ignored, my documentation unanswered. The fines levied against me in retaliation, 3 in total, each with vague or fabricated justifications, one ironically for misuse of water resources. We even played the clip of her screaming after the flood. Yes, someone had captured it on their phone from across the street. It wasn't cruel. It was context. It showed a leader in collapse, a person who had refused to listen, now trying to rewrite her role in the story. Karen's lawyer scrambled to spin it. He argued that the board had acted in aesthetic and community interest, citing homeowner complaints about standing puddles and mosquito larvae. He claimed the sealed drains were temporary solutions and that Karen had acted in good faith, using her authority as board president. But Judge Huynh wasn't swayed. She leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, and asked a simple question. "Did your client consult with the city of Rose Grove before modifying public infrastructure?" The attorney stammered. "Well, I believe there were informal discussions." "Do you have documentation?" He didn't. Monica stood. "We do, Your Honor." Written confirmation from the city engineer's office that no permission was granted to the HOA to modify storm drains in any capacity. She handed it over. The judge read silently for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were sharp. Let the record show, she said, that the actions taken by the HOA board, specifically its president, were not only unauthorized, but in direct violation of city code. Furthermore, the timing of those modifications during peak storm season, after multiple warnings from qualified individuals, constitutes willful negligence. Karen's shoulders sagged visibly. It was like watching scaffolding collapse after the building inside had rotted. The judge continued, "This court recommends that the city of Rose Grove formally revoke the current HOA board's operational status, pending further investigation. All fines levied by the board against Mr. Callahan are to be reversed and his legal record expunged. Additionally, the county will proceed with a civil liability review to determine financial restitution for affected residents." Karen didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. After the hearing, people clapped. Not like a stadium ovation, but quietly, relieved, like pressure finally releasing from a valve long sealed shut. Outside, the air was warm and clear. A breeze carried the scent of cut grass and something brighter, maybe hope, maybe just the absence of fear. Luis stood by his truck waiting. "How'd it go?" he asked. I told him. He grinned. "Guess we're not just homeowners anymore." "No," I said. "We're witnesses. And we're done being quiet." That weekend, a special meeting was held in the community center. Without Karen. Without the board. Just neighbors, ordinary people with mud still on their boots now building something new. We formed a temporary committee. We drafted new bylaws. We voted openly, democratically. We didn't talk about power. We talked about service. I didn't run for anything. I just showed up, clipboard in hand, ready to help. The storm had come. The cars had floated and twisted and vanished. But something else had risen in their place. Accountability. Justice. Community. The first thing we did was remove the steel plates. Not just the ones Karen had ordered bolted over the storm drains, but every lingering trace of her beautification initiative. The sandbags disguised as mulch, borders the fake landscaping stones that blocked water channels, even the HOA signs planted in the medians warning about visual cohesion policies. One by one we peeled them back. The city helped this time, for real. A small fleet of workers arrived with industrial vacuum pumps, hydraulic tools, and a full stormwater inspection team. I stood beside them as they examined the damage, many shaking their heads in disbelief. One technician turned to me and said, "You know, we had no idea this was going on. If you hadn't documented everything." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The flood had exposed more than faulty drains. It had exposed a culture of silence, of fear, of homeowners looking over their shoulders wondering if speaking up meant being fined, harassed, or isolated. But that culture was crumbling. The HOA in its former form was dissolved, legally, publicly. Karen never returned to the meetings. Rumor had it she'd moved in with her sister in Arizona, trying to dodge lawsuits and maybe salvage her name. Her house sat dark for weeks before a for sale by owner sign appeared barely legible through the vines beginning to reclaim the front porch. No one bothered to remove them. We held a new election on a clear Saturday morning in the community park. No campaign speeches, no finger pointing, just coffee clipboards and quiet conversations about what people actually needed. Jenna was elected president. Luis vice president. Mr. Tran volunteered to manage maintenance oversight. I declined any official position. That wasn't why I came here. My job wasn't to lead. It was to speak up when silence became dangerous. I promised to serve on the new infrastructure committee, help revise the emergency response plan, and train neighbors on flood prep. That was enough. 3 weeks after the flood, with most of the debris cleared and families finally returning to something like normal, I took a long walk around the block. The maple trees had survived, though some bore deep gashes where cars had scraped against them like ships against rocks. Lawns were green again, if patchy. The air was cleaner. And the drains, open, clear, glistening with the morning dew, as if reminding us all that water would always find its way, and it was our job to guide it, not block it. I passed by Luis's driveway, where he was polishing the hood of a used SUV he'd bought to replace the old Buick. He looked up and grinned. "Bet this one floats better," he joked. I laughed. "Just keep it uphill." At Jenna's house, her daughter was drawing in chalk on the dry sidewalk flowers, sun's little blue streams flowing between square houses. "Is that our street?" I asked. She nodded. "It's better now." Better. Not perfect, but honest. We still had problems. Insurance claims were slow. Some garages were still musty. And the HOA budget, drained by poor leadership and unnecessary legal costs, would take months to rebuild. But people talked now. Not through app posts or passive-aggressive flyers, but face-to-face. Over coffee, in driveways. With kids laughing in the background and hands full of tools, not tickets. A month later, the city hosted a neighborhood recognition event honoring Hawthorne Lane for community resilience and civic responsibility. I stood in the back as Jenna accepted the plaque. She thanked the city. Then she looked at me. And thank you to the neighbor who warned us, who didn't back down, who reminded us what it means to be a community. Applause followed, real applause. Not just for me, but for all of us. Because surviving a flood isn't just about sandbags and blueprints. It's about people, listening, acting, owning their part in what comes next. That night, I returned home, poured a drink, and sat on my porch. I could hear laughter in the distance, a screen door creaking, a dog barking, and somewhere in the background, the sound I'd grown to love most, water draining cleanly freely down an unblocked street.